All right, Lord, thank you for today and for this class. I pray that you will help us to grow and be stretched, help us to learn and have understanding. I pray that you'll speak through me. Let this be a fruitful class for each of us, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So today we are going to kind of pick up where we were at last week, where we had started a discussion on the temple, right? And so I won't go back and rehearse everything that we did last week. But a big part of it was the progression of the temple, is what we went through last week, how it was foreshadowed in in the Garden of Eden. We see individual places of worship from Abraham's time through the patriarchs. Then with Moses, we begin to see the tabernacle. That followed them through to Ebal, where they built a new altar there at Ebal. If you remember that, we talked about Gerizim and Ebal. So they built a new altar there at Ebal. And then at Shiloh, we know that there was a temple set up at Shiloh as well. The Bible doesn't talk too much about what happened at Shiloh. Shiloh was a city in Ephraim's territory. Right? This was one of the first religious centers, right? So before there was Jerusalem, there was Shiloh. Shiloh is where Samuel, that was the temple that Samuel was involved in, right? The tabernacle there, right? The place of worship. When Eli the high priest was there and his sons offered strange fire and they were killed, and then Samuel then is raised in that basic city with that kind of worship environment that they had there at Shiloh. And so Samuel is called. Remember, the Lord calls out to him, and he thought it was Eli, and he went 3 different times, and finally, he said, "Lord, here am I," and it ended up being the Lord speaking to him. That was at Shiloh. And between Shiloh and Jerusalem, we know that at some point the ark was taken, right? We know that. There's an interesting passage, I want to say it was Ezekiel, where the Lord is saying to the people in Jerusalem who are thinking that they are above judgment, right? So fast forward to Jerusalem is a strong temple. It had not been destroyed yet. Think the reigns of Hezekiah and Manasseh, some of those last long reigning kings. God is promising through the prophets, primarily Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then we've got Daniel. All 3 of those were at the same time. So Daniel was prophesying from Babylon. Ezekiel was prophesying from just outside of Babylon, right, at the same time, right? So if you didn't know that, that's kind of an interesting thought, that Ezekiel was outside with the stragglers, who didn't have much of an area. I mean, they had like these certain fields that were designated to them, and they had to build their own homes and things like that. They did have access to water. And so in that environment is where Ezekiel is. At the same time, Daniel is vice president of the country, and he is just on the other side of town at the same time as Ezekiel. And then at this same time, oh yeah, you can come on in. At this same time, we just started like 2 seconds ago. At this same time, on the other side is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is actually at the temple, working at the temple as a priest and engaging there in Jerusalem. And so these 3 guys are ministering at the same time. Isaiah was before these, but Isaiah talked as much about the destruction of the temple as they did, but Isaiah predated these guys by about 50 years. And so in the prophecies that God is going to destroy the temple, he makes a reference to Shiloh, which is what we're talking about. And God tells them, he says, if you don't think that I'll destroy Jerusalem, go ask the people in Shiloh what I'll do when someone turns from me, right? And so that allows us to see that Shiloh didn't just disappear, that Shiloh was destroyed, presumably in that same attack where they took the ark, and where the Philistines came in and took the ark. Eli died. During that same attack, the Bible doesn't mention anything about them destroying that area. The Bible just says that report came back because the ark was not at the temple at the time. The ark was in the battlefield. If you remember, they decided to send the ark into the battle. And so the ark was taken on the battlefield. Men came back to Shiloh, gave the report to Eli that the ark had been taken, and that's when Eli died. And so that's all that we hear. We hear that there was a son born then at that time. They called him Ichabod. The glory has departed. But we don't hear anything else about what happened to Shiloh. But then when God is talking to them about the destruction of Jerusalem, he says, if you don't think I'll allow the temple area to be destroyed, go ask Shiloh what I allowed happen to them. And so apparently this whole area was destroyed during that time, right? Be interesting to go back. I don't know off the top of my head. I had to do some research. I just had a thought pop into my head. I wonder if there are any references to Moses' tabernacle after this destruction, because that would have been what would have been set up, would have been Moses' tabernacle. So I don't know. I'd have to go in and look. But that's at least a thought. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. If there's not, then hey, maybe that's what was destroyed. But I don't know without going back and look. It was an interesting thought. But we do know that God said that Shiloh was destroyed as an example of how you could have God's presence there, but if you turn your back on the Lord, that eventually he's going to allow judgment to come in. And so they were thinking that because this was God's temple, that he would always protect them. And his point was that they were not walking in any of his commands, really. And so he was going to allow them to be destroyed. So Shiloh is kind of a short-lived example here, but for some people this was their temple. So you think prior to David, which was a large portion of Israel's history, through all of the period of the judges was just as long as the period of the kings, right? So David was like the halfway point. David was in about 1000 BC. The temple was destroyed in 586. So what's that, 400 years? And then before them, they came into the promised land in 1400 or so, and David was 1000, so that was another 400 years. So David's right in the middle. So for half of Israel's history as a nation, biblical history as a nation, there was no Jerusalem and there was no temple. This was enemy territory. Jerusalem was. It was Shiloh that was the place of worship for most of the time. So that's why when God is speaking to Moses, he says that they're only allowed to worship at the place that I put my name, right? He doesn't say they're only allowed to worship at Jerusalem, because the place where God put his name changed at different seasons of the nation's history. For a long time, until David comes along at the halfway point of Israel's existence, the Jebusites owned Jerusalem. It was an enemy city. It didn't have anything to do with God's people. So all the way through with Deborah and Joshua and all of these major stories, Gideon, all of the judges, that entire period, even all the way up through Samuel, a large part of Samuel's life, Jerusalem was not owned by Israel, and so all they knew was Shiloh. So it's kind of interesting. Nowadays, when we think of major cities in Israel, we only think of Jerusalem, right? But if you look at the whole of the history, Shiloh was the place as much as Jerusalem was, right? So kind of interesting to kind of look at that. So that brings us then to the temples in Jerusalem. So that's where I want to focus today, is on those temples, right? And what do we know about them archaeologically, right? So we know that there were basically 3 versions of this temple. So during David's time, he actually had something called the Tent of David, right? Which makes me wonder if that's because Moses' tabernacle was clearly no longer there by the time of David. So we have from Shiloh to David, which is less than 100 years, and David is not using the tabernacle. David is using something called the Tent of David prior to building, in Solomon's day, building the actual temple. So we don't hear any reference in David's time to Moses' tabernacle. We hear David had built his own tent of worship, right? Called the tent of David. And so,
indication maybe that the tabernacle of Moses was gone.
yeah, it could have been destroyed. So we're looking at a long time from Moses to Shiloh, right? Only a short time from Shiloh to David, because Samuel was there at Shiloh. That was the place during Samuel's life, and Samuel anointed David, so they crossed over in lives. David was probably in his 20s or so before Samuel died, and so they crossed over quite a bit. So the securing of Jerusalem, and then David having something called the tent of David. So when it talks about the worship during David's time, they refer to it as the tent of David. So you'd think if it was Moses' tabernacle that they were still using, that they had just called it that. So what I'd like to go back in and look at is, in Shiloh, do they reference Moses' tabernacle there? So that would be the key. Was Shiloh mentioned as still having Moses' tabernacle, or does it not say one way or the other? Would be, I don't remember anything that says it did, but that doesn't mean it didn't. So either it said, so if it doesn't say anything about that being Moses' tabernacle, then it could have been destroyed beforehand. But clearly by the time of David, we don't hear anything about, okay, Moses' tabernacle is still there, let's take care of it, let's pack it away. So we don't hear any of that, And so a couple interesting things, that when we do get to David's selecting of the area for the temple, if you remember the story, there's a plague breaking out, right? So David has sinned. He did an unauthorized census of the country. So the census itself is not evil, because God had Moses do one. I mean, that's what the whole book of Numbers is. That's why they call it Numbers, is because he took the number of the people. So the act of doing a census itself is not evil. There were times when God ordered it. It had to have been David's motivation then, that David, for some reason, felt like he needed to do the census so that he could have confidence in the military, as opposed to just having confidence in God no matter how many people he had. That's why Joab resisted doing it, right? If it was just a matter of just counting just for numbers' sake, it wouldn't have been a big deal, but it was clearly something where David was counting so that he could have confidence and boastfulness in the size of the army, and that's where the evil lied. And so so we have David sinning, right? And God gives him the option, right? 3 days of a plague, or time under the enemy's hand, all that kind of stuff. He gives him these 3 options, and David comes back and says, I don't want to be under the enemy at all. Let me just have the 3 days of being under the Lord's judgment, because maybe the Lord will be merciful to us. So as this judgment is sweeping across the land and people are dying by the plague left and right, there is the command to go to the threshing floor, right? And that's where the Lord stops the plague at this threshing floor, and that's where the Lord tells David that is where the future temple is going to be set up, right? And so it's at that place. So the interesting part about that is that David doesn't own that land, surprisingly enough, right? David had to pay for that property. So here he is, right in Jerusalem, in his hometown where the temple is going to be. David is already king. This is the end of David's life, so he's been king the whole time. And there is somebody here who owns a farm on the top of the mountain there at Jerusalem, and it doesn't even belong to David, right? And the guy's name is Arunah, something like that, Arunah. But he is described as being a Jebusite, right? So that was the people, the enemy that had the land before David took it. So clearly somewhere along the way, David, perhaps this guy was, a nice guy or something and pled with David for mercy or something, but somehow a Jebusite is still owning a large part of Jerusalem even during the time of David, because David goes to this Jebusite and buys the field that would eventually become Solomon's temple from a Jebusite, right, which was the enemies that they took the place from in the first place, right? So I don't know what this guy did to get favor. The Bible doesn't say, but somehow he must have gotten some kind of favor from David, because David was not happy with the Jebusites when they took it over. If you remember, they were the ones that mocked David from the walls, And so they pretty much killed most of the people when they entered into the city. So how this guy escaped, it doesn't say. But we do have a Jebusite who's there who owns a large part of land, not just any land, the part where the temple is going to be, he still owns, right? And so, so that land is purchased, which I'm sure they put that in there. Whoever wrote those books wanted to make sure that was in there, I'm sure, because they wanted everybody to know Israel had a valid right to that land. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, he wanted to give it to David, and so David said, no, I'm going to pay for it. And so I think that was an important part that's included in the story, because that was the key piece of real estate in Israel, and they wanted everybody to know, we paid for this fair and square, this is ours, right? Not, oh, somebody gave it to you, and really that belongs to us, because that happened at different stages during Israel's development. If you remember, the people that Moses defeated on the eastern side of the Jordan River, right? So if we've got Israel here, obviously, and Moses is the one that took all of this half of what is today Israel, during David's time was Israel, and then Joshua and them took the other half, right? So Moses takes all of this land where Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were. And so in this place was Sihon and Og, right, the kings of the Amorites in this land. And so there are kings then that follow. They weren't all killed totally. They defeated their enemy, but there were other groups, that still lived in this area that raised up. And one of those came back to Israel and said, we want our land back. You took this from us during Moses' day, and this actually belonged to us, and you took it from us unfairly. We want it back. And so they came in and pitched a fit. And the people over here didn't have a strong army, and so because it's the period of the judges, they weren't centralized yet. And so they're fearful for their life because they didn't have the means to withstand this enemy king. And he said, I tell you what, I'll let you stay there on one condition. Everyone in the whole city, in this whole part of the land, cuts out their right eye. If you cut out your right eye, then I'll let you stay. If not, I'm going to come in and kill all of you. And so they agreed to cut out their eyes because they didn't want to die. And then, though, they sent word to these people and said, hey, look, we're in trouble over here. We've agreed to cut out our right eye. And then the Lord raised up an army, and they came over there and defeated them, right? But that was so that has happened to them before, where something that was taken in battle, then somebody wants to come back in and say, well, hey, really that land belongs to us. You see it even today with a lot of the Arab groups are over there wanting to contend with Israel over what is theirs, particularly Jordan, right? For a long time was contending with them over who owns what, right? And then now you've got the Palestinians. I almost said Pakistanis because of the news story. The Palestinians are over here exerting pressure, right? And so anyways.
Syria at the top is still on high.
Yeah, and so Syria has always been an enemy as well. So Syria was David's, it's still there today, was David's big enemy, right? So when David sends Joab to go to war, think Bathsheba, when David decided not to go to war, and it says that it was the time when kings were supposed to go to war, it was the big battle against Syria, right? So this was not just some small battle. This was their major opposition that David didn't go to war during that time. And so Joab says, we're winning, right? And he says, now you better show up, otherwise I'll get the credit for this one, right? And so anyways, that was battles with Syria. So throughout history, this area has been hotly contested, right? And so that's one of the interesting things about the fact that this was purchased by David from a Jebusite, right? Hey, come on in. You can slip right through here if you want. And so that brings us to Solomon's building project, right? So Solomon begins to build his temple. All right, better get quick if I want to go through all this. All right, so Solomon is building his temple, and we know from later works, right? We know that the three were Ezra and Nehemiah had come back and worked on rebuilding some of the ruins of Solomon's temple. And then in that same spot, we know that Herod came along later and did a complete renovation, right? So the Ezra-Nehemiah project was probably not to the quality of what Herod or Solomon did. They were rebuilding with the best that they could, but this was not a thing from scratch. It was a rebuilding ruins kind of thing. If it had been super great, Herod wouldn't have felt the need to put all that money into redoing it, right? So, but they're all in the same basic spot, right? That the Temple Mount was considered holy, and that was the place where they would do most of the temple renovations were in these same spots, right? So a couple interesting points from that then. We know from some non-biblical, I mean, the Bible references a little bit, but from non-biblical sources, when they're discussing in some of the rabbis' works how they would go about the sacrifices and that type of stuff, they talk about how the temple was at the Gihon Spring, right? And that's just a place there in Jerusalem, and it was called the Gihon Spring. And so it was a source of water that flowed up through the mountaintop and then back down out through different tunnels. And so it was a nice spring that emerged right there at the top that provided fresh water. And so that was connected to the very front part of the temple, and so we have writings where it discussed what the high priest would do each year. And so the Gihon Spring, we know, was right there at the entrance to the temple in the outer court, in the part where you couldn't just go in, where only the priests were allowed in. The outer court is where the altar was and where the basin was for washing. And we know that the Gihon Spring passed through there because they said that the high priest on the Day of Atonement would go into the spring, and that's where he would wash so that he didn't have to walk through town on the day that he was going to enter into the Holy of Holies, right? And so we know that the temple was right there at the Gihon Spring, and it also provided the water for washing away the blood and the remains from all these sacrifices, right? So there at that altar, they're killing all kinds of animals, and so this spring provided the water that washed all of this stuff out. This is why when Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, and he is trying to show her that it is not, remember we talked last week about whether you're going to worship at Gerizim or at Jerusalem, and he said there's coming a time when you won't worship at either one because the Father is seeking those who worship him in spirit and in truth. So that is the discussion, is where are you supposed to worship? And Jesus says that those who believe on me, out of their bellies shall flow rivers of living water, right? What is he saying? He's saying in Jerusalem, the picture is the temple with the spring of fresh water running out the front, right? That is how the temple was set up. There's the temple, and then this spring, this river of water that flowed out from the front. And so that's why Ezekiel later says that there's going to be this river, and it flows, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger when he's talking about the future temple, right? And it's clearly metaphorical because it's talking about this river consuming the whole world. He's talking about the future temple is the Spirit of the Lord. And so, but the image that Jesus uses to describe himself as the temple, which he later does, he says, you kill this temple, I'll raise it up in 3 days. He wasn't talking about the building, he's talking about himself. He is the temple. And so he says that out of his belly, right, it's originally a prophecy about the Messiah. Now we apply it to ourselves sometimes too, that out of our bellies shall flow rivers of living water once we're filled with the Spirit. But the prophecy was about the Messiah that Jesus is quoting. And it says, from out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water, meaning that he is the new temple, right? That's why the water is flowing out of him, like at Solomon's temple, the water was flowing out the front of the temple, that Jesus is the new temple, right? And so the reason that that's important, right, to understand all of that, to know the history behind the river that was connected to the front of the temple, is because that river then gives us a clue about where the temple had to be, right? I mean, the river is flowing out the front of where the temple was, and so if we can figure out where the Gihon Spring is, then we have a better chance of figuring out where the temple is. Now, to some of you, you may think, well, why do we need to figure out where the temple is? Thought it was pretty clear where the temple is. They got the big Wailing Wall, they got the big foundation stones of the temple are still there. Well, so that's what we should talk about, is that part. if I was to ask you what is standing now on the temple, right? And you guys aren't allowed to answer. If I was to ask you now what is standing on the temple, the spot where the Holy of Holies was, what would you say? Like if you go to Israel right now, what is it that was built on that spot? Anybody know? It's supposed to be right over the spot where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. They built a building on top of it. It's kind of like a church, but it doesn't have anything to do with Christianity.
Muslim?
Yeah, so think the Dome of the Rock, right? The Dome of the Rock, the big golden dome that's there. Yeah, well, Mecca is a holy city for the Muslims. The other major holy spot is called the Dome of the Rock, right? And so if you were to go to Israel right now on what they call Solomon's Temple Mount is a giant golden Muslim building that Christians aren't allowed to go in. And what people say today is that Dome of the Rock is built over where the old Holy of Holies was, right? So you think the temple had the outer court where the sacrifices were, and then the priest could also go in to the most holy place, which is where they prepared the bread, the altar of incense, and the golden lampstand. And then there was a veil, and on the other side was the most holy place, and only the high priest could go in there once a year. And he had to be super pure. That's why he's washing in the stream that's right there right before he goes in, because he doesn't want to become impure by walking through town on the way there, because if he's impure when he goes in, he dies, right? So they would tie a rope around his ankle before he went in, so that if he died, they could pull him back out, because no one else could go in there. So if he died and you didn't have a way to pull him back out, somebody would have to go in there to get him, and they would die too, because they weren't allowed to go in there. And so, so he was very peculiar, about making sure he was clean before he went in there, because it was well known that if you weren't, you would die. If you entered the presence of the Lord in an impure way. And so we have the Dome of the Rock is there now. So that's where we'll start, because that's where, if you asked most people who have looked at this at all, where was the Holy of Holies, the going theory is that that's why they built the Dome of the Rock there, is because that was a holy site to the Muslims, because they traced their lineage back to Abraham also, right? So if this is where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, then it becomes a holy spot for the Muslims too. And so as the story goes, that they chose that spot because that's where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and so it becomes a holy spot for them too. And so then later stories emerged, later traditions about things with Muhammad and what he did there and stuff like that. But those were all later traditions. Interestingly enough, if you go back in and research the original kind of stories and documents that talk about why that mosque was built there, it is because underneath, like say if this is the temple and you've got the Muslim mosque here, prior to the Crusades in those times, a church was built here a little lower down the mountain. So the Muslims, as a geographic way of expressing that they were greater than the Christians, built their church directly higher than it, just right above, as if to say, we're better than you. So they put themselves higher on the mountain. It had nothing to do with anything that they thought took place in this spot. It had to do with the fact they wanted to be higher than this church that was here on this side, so they put theirs here. So it originally had nothing to do with the Holy of Holies or where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. That's what they say now, because they like the idea that they have such an important spot.
Why they should stay.
Yeah, and why they should stay there. And so they're here. Now, here's where the confusion started. You say, well, how did that ever start?